Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center's Middle East Programs panel this morning on the risks of escalation and impact on Lebanon of the ongoing Hamas-Israel war. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I'm the director of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center. Hamas's unprecedented October 7th attack on Israel and the ensuing Hamas-Israel war has impacted regional security and U.S. national security interests in the Middle East. Iranian-backed Hezbollah has been engaged in clashes with the IDF on Israel's northern border, escalating regional tension and conflict beyond southern Israel and Gaza. We're joined today by an expert panel, a stellar panel, starting with Ambassador David Hale, who's currently a global fellow here at the Wilson Center and former ambassador to Jordan and Lebanon. Mona Yacobian, who's the Vice President of the Middle East and North Africa Center at the United States Institute of Peace. Brenda Slim, who's a Senior Fellow and Director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues Program at the Middle East Institute. Ambassador Ed Gabriel, who's the President of the American Task Force on Lebanon. And joining us a little bit later in the discussion will be Congressman Isakson, who's representing the 48th District of California. Ambassador Hale, the Zoom floor is yours. And before we just move forward to all our online audience, please submit your questions in the comment section. Thank you. I think you're muted, David.
There we are. Hello again, and thank you very much, Marissa, and thank you to my colleagues for joining us. I'm very happy to be with this distinguished group. We have a lot to talk about, so I'll turn rapidly to each of our participants for a 3 to 5 minute opening comment, and then I have some questions, and then we'll turn to what we get from the audience. Obviously, as Marissa said, the topic is the risk of escalation, the ongoing escalation, in fact, that is occurring. And I wouldn't limit it to the region, as we saw with the apparent interception of an terrorist operation in Brazil. That we know that Hezbollah has global capacities as well, so we need to monitor and assess. So why don't we start in no particular order? On my screen, Ed Gabriel is first up, so we'll turn to Ambassador Gabriel. We need to unmute you, Ed.
And there we are. Thank you very much, David, Marissa, and the Wilson Center for putting together this important seminar. It's a pleasure also to be with distinguished experts regarding the current situation in Lebanon. Thank you very much. Let me just give you an overview of how I see the situation. I think right now, in the current situation, Lebanon's #1 priority is to avoid being drawn into further conflict. Stability on its southern border is essential, given its frail state and failing situation. Right now, I don't see either side wanting a conflict. Nasrallah's speech, I think, was about as good as we could have expected in this regard as well. Israel also at present doesn't want to open up a new front for several reasons. In spite of what Defense Minister Gallant's initial call for preemptive action was, in this regard, we have to thank the Biden administration for their swift action to deter that kind of decision. Iran appears not to have directed the war and has made it clear that it prefers a de-escalation. And of course, the longer there is significant military action in Gaza, the more chance for miscalculation and excuses for Iran in its proxies to make a miscalculation. So let me make 3 quick points. One, Lebanon's parliament needs to elect a president. More than ever, Lebanon needs a head of state on the other end of the line when world leaders call, other than a caretaker, to caution against escalation and to call for neutrality. I believe, it's sometimes in the worst of times that we find the ripest time for action. I'm an optimist, but I believe that. And I believe the quintet, US, Saudi, Qatar, France, Egypt, understand there is no substitute for them bridging the parties together to find a new consensus candidate. And also, but it'll take, in my opinion, the US to push and pull the quintet into action, and for Qatar and Saudi to show some leadership in this effort, as they have the trust of the Quint and can talk to all parties. Number two, I think US needs a stronger Iran policy. The address for Hezbollah is Tehran, not Beirut. In this regard, the US has continually made it clear to Iran that it will be held responsible for any escalation by its proxies in the region. And the US should have learned in the last few weeks that a nuclear agreement alone with Iran doesn't serve the total interest of US. It's time now that we reconsider a US-Iran strategy within the context of a clear Middle East regional strategy. Number three, the US needs to reassert its leadership as peacemaker and facilitator. As we all know, the US is no longer perceived as neutral in many communities around the world. When Russia likes what we're doing and China is offering to be the peace negotiator in the region, we're doing something wrong. And I believe the US, for political and other reasons, has to carefully rebalance its position with regard to the war and its relationship with its Gulf partners. In Lebanon, the US needs to call out Israel for killing innocent people in Lebanon, shepherds, families traveling from one village to the other, killing a reporter. I mean, come on, burning olive trees with phosphorus bombs. This is what creates escalation. And the US needs to lead with Saudi, Qatar, UAE, Egypt, and other Middle East and European allies on a strategy for the day after. And immediately it needs to put in all of its statements, when it talks about the war, a reference to the right of self-determination for the Palestinian people. In this regard, I think Saudi and the United States have a lot of ability to offer such a process. So in conclusion, let me just say there's no substitute for American leadership, leading with its sense of values and its interest. And the US has to make sure that Iran and Israel understand that escalation is in no one's interest. And it's during the toughest of times that may be the ripest for pushing an election of a president and a process for peace between Palestine and Israel. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Ed. That's a terrific framing for our discussion. Let me turn now to Mona Yacoubian, who's next on my screen, and then we'll turn to Randa after that.
Thanks so much, David, and to the Wilson Center, and a sincere pleasure to be with such esteemed panelists. So I may dive a little bit deeper from some of the points that Ed laid down. Let me start by saying, maybe start with one good news point, which is, I think the good news is it seems fairly clear that Hezbollah, and by extension Iran, has thus far calculated that it does not make sense to open a second front in this conflict between Israel and Hamas. I think this largely stems from a calculus on the part of Hezbollah that this will not redound to its benefit, given the very severe economic, social, political crisis that Lebanon is already experiencing. Lebanon today is already a country on its knees. To invite what would be a catastrophic response on the part of Israel at this time, I think, is not in Hezbollah's interest, is not certainly in Lebanon's interest. I also think Hezbollah would risk significant blowback domestically were it to undertake a rash decision such as that. Now, that being said, we are in an incredibly dangerous and fluid time in the region. I actually think the level of danger is unprecedented. And David, as you noted from the outset, we are already seeing escalation. And that would lead to my second point, which is we're seeing a very dangerous level of escalation beyond the border with Lebanon, elsewhere in the region. More than 40 attacks against U.S. targets since mid-October by Iranian-backed proxies, very significant. We're seeing the Houthis engage using long-range missiles and drones. We're seeing deepening tensions in Syria. And for me, this raises the point of, number one, the potential for miscalculation and unintended escalation that could very well lead to a regional conflagration. Any of these probing attacks that have been undertaken by these various proxies could lead to either significant U.S. casualties, could lead to civilian casualties, whether in Israel or elsewhere, which would very quickly, I think, set in motion a series of responses that could quickly escalate to a much broader regional conflagration. Lastly, I think, is the point of what the U.S. is doing. And here I think it's important to think through the measures that the United States has taken to deter escalation. So we've seen two U.S. strikes, including one today, against IRGC-related targets in Syria. I think it's a big question as to whether these strikes are going to be sufficient to deter future strikes. We saw one strike in mid-October by the U.S. and a continuation, if not acceleration, of Iranian proxy-backed attacks on U.S. targets. Will the strike that was undertaken today be enough? Hard to know. I think the issue, however, is the U.S. has to really tread a fine line between deterring future attacks and potentially escalating itself in ways that are unintended. The United States is in no way, shape, or form interested in a broad conflict in the region. The U.S. has also deployed fairly significant additional military assets to the region, 2 aircraft carrier groups to the Mediterranean, a nuclear-armed submarine, THAAD missiles, as well as additional U.S. forces poised to deploy. And lastly, the U.S. is also, I think, undertaking a series of diplomatic efforts. We had Secretary Blinken make a round in the region, including to Iraq. We have Envoy Amos Hochstein in Lebanon. In recent days, we have CIA Director Bill Burns in the region. I think these diplomatic entreaties are going to be as important, but the question really remains, and I don't have the answer, how the escalation dynamics in the region continue to evolve, and whether or not the measures that the United States has taken to date will be sufficient to curb additional escalation. Much, of course, last point, will really depend on the conflict itself, on what happens in Gaza, and also I think we need to have an eye on the Arab street and how Arab publics respond, and to what extent do the combination of what's happening on the ground in Gaza plus the reaction in the Arab and even broader Muslim world itself becomes a dynamic that potentially propels greater escalation. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mona. As always, some terrific analysis and a lot of material there. And I want to come back to a couple points, in particular, your observation on the finding that balance, or that fine line between deterrence and unintended, or in fact intended, escalation. It's a very difficult calculation to have to make. Rhonda, shall we turn to you?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Wilson Center, for the invitation. Glad to be with this esteemed panel of experts. I'm going to talk I'm going to present on two themes. One is Hezbollah and Lebanon, and two is the axis of resistance. And what does this war say about the axis of resistance now and going forward? The first, it's very clear, building on what Ed and Mona said, that Hezbollah is not seeking a war. However, if we look at the Lebanese Israeli front, as Nasrallah said in his November 3 speech, there has been a war going. The 2006 rules of the road have been violated and are constantly being violated, are in a stage of renegotiation. There are two prominent features, in my opinion, two prominent points to take from Nasrallah's speech. One is this emphasis on the red line that civilians should not be hit. And that goes back to the April understanding between Hezbollah and Israel following the Grapes of Wrath war, where that was part of the understanding. Civilians on either side should not be hit. There were violations here and there, but usually they stuck to it. Then after 2006, there was an understanding, tacit understanding between them, not only about the civilian, but also about where they can engage, mostly limited to the Shab'a farms, which was a contested territory. I think since then, these rules have been violated. Civilians are being hit on either side, on both sides, and weapons that are being used are unlike previous weapons being used. Fighting has now, the geographical scope of the fighting has expanded all the way, about 40 kilometers inside Lebanese territories, suburbs of Haifa in Israel. And what you see is these two sides trying again through violence to escalate, but at the same time trying to avoid the risk of going into an all-out war. The question is, where is that threshold for each side about, an overall war? What does Israel interpret as a trigger for this overall war with Hezbollah? What does Hezbollah, identify as a trigger for, going into an overall war with Israel? It's very clear from Nasrallah's speech and previous statements by other Hezbollah officials that they have two red lines in the ongoing Hamas-Israel war. One is to prevent, the destruction of Hamas military infrastructure and denying Hamas ability to reconstitute itself in Gaza and to govern in the future. That's one red line. And the second red line is a forced displacement of people from Gaza, outside Gaza, but also from the West Bank. And so what is the threshold that they will, for example, they use in determining that Hamas can no longer survive the onslaught? Again, this is something that Nasrallah referred to in his speech as part of their typical MO of strategic ambiguity. He did not go into detail about that. The speech, the way I see it, it's neither a call for de-escalation nor a call to arms, as many Lebanese have feared that was going to be the case. He's going to give another speech next Saturday, and I think it's going to be elaborating on the same themes. But I think what we are seeing in the tit for tat escalation between them, which is gaining in intensity, gaining in geographical scope, is still trying to stick to proportionality, but at the same time trying to, hurt the other side enough to reestablish deterrence. And the question is, again, in this process of hitting each other enough and escalating it proportionality, at some point there is a risk not of miscalculation. I don't think there is miscalculation between them. I think there are enough channels of communication indirect between them to be able to communicate, but in the fog of war, maybe assessments or errors are made that can then bring the country into an all-out war between with Israel. Now, I mean, it has been said about Iran's role in all of this. I think Khalid Mash'al himself said that that the planning, the training, the financing was done, and credited Iran and Hezbollah in that part. Nasrallah tried to distance himself in the speech from the timing of the operation, which I believe is normal in this kind of operation, that the decision of timing or the timing decision is limited to a very small circle of decision makers. But he did not distance himself from the planning or from the, from that kind of role. He was very specific in what he said in his speech in terms of timing. The second part, a related point I want to say about Hezbollah in Lebanon. I mean, it's clear this time, this is the second time that it happened. First with the Syria war, when Hezbollah decided to interfere, to go into the Syrian war to support Assad, despite a policy of disassociation at the time struck inside the Lebanese cabinet, which included 2 Hezbollah ministers at the time. Yet the decision was made by Hezbollah that they are going to go in to help Assad basically survive the revolution. And this is the second time they do that. They go into a war, or not full-fledged war, but bringing the country to the brinks of war without any regard to, official Lebanon, if we can put it this way, prime minister, speaker of parliament. Now, their margin of maneuvering here is larger. There is wide support in Lebanon for what's happening for the Palestinian in Gaza. So I think they have more of a room of maneuvering than was the case in Syria, which definitely split the Lebanese population into and polarized the perspective. Here, there is much wider acceptance of Hezbollah trying to help the Palestinians. But again, building on what the previous speakers have said, I think there is also reluctance for Lebanon to go into another war, given the dire economic straits it is in. But it's important to point that on war and peace issues, Hezbollah has now appropriated that decision-making process, and that should basically be part of the discussions going forward when we talk about the US support for Lebanon, and especially when there is a new president, if there is a new president in the future, that should be part of the discussion, but not only with the heads of state, but also with other members of the political spectrum in Lebanon. Granted, on Palestinian issue, given what's the horrendous civilian death toll in Gaza, there is limited room of maneuvering to criticize Hezbollah involvement in support of the Palestinian. But still, it is a discussion that needs to be had with whoever is going to be president, speaker, most probably Berri, and prime minister, but also with other members of the political elites, opponents of Hezbollah, about what to do about this going forward, in terms of war and peace decisions for Lebanon. Finally, I want to say relate this to the resistance, to the axis of resistance. Building on what Mona has said, it's very clear that now we have a much more coherent axis of resistance, coherent operationally, coherent ideologically, axis of resistance working under the stewardship of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. This is a project that Iran has been engaged in since the founding of the revolution, and more so after the war with Iraq, when it had to fight not only Iraq, but an Iraq supported by a great majority of Arab states except Syria. This was a project that was put together to enable Iran to play a hegemon role, to give Iran the capacity to defend itself through proxies and partners in the region, what they called forward defense strategy, and to be able, through this proxy network, to fight what they call the Israeli-US project in the region. And that has been the case. But in the beginning, when this network was established, it was more a collection of actors that had overlapping interests. Their interactions were mostly episodic, transactional, and they were all risk averse. They preferred covert operations. However, I think after the Syria war, during the Syria war, after the attack of ISIS in Mosul in 2014, and since then, this axis has become very coherent. It has become basically a fighting machine. It's more like now an alliance, a fighting alliance. And we have seen, as Mona has said, Houthis working, sending missile and drone. We have seen the Islamic resistance in Iraq, targeting US assets in northeastern Syria, western Iraq, northern Iraq. And then you have Hezbollah, of course, as the primary, basically actor within this umbrella. And that builds very much to Ed's points about US-Iran policy and linking it to Middle East policy. Iran's preference going forward is not the elimination of Israel. Its preference is for Israel to remain mired in never-ending conflicts and for its proxies, and basically thus giving the mission, the raison d'etre to the proxy network that it has built in the Arab region with Hamas, with Islamic Jihad, with Hezbollah, with the Houthis, with the Iraqi militias. And so going forward, we need to, this network, this axis, is not going anywhere. In fact, it has now more solidified, and it's even more ideologically loyal to Tehran. And so hence the idea of thinking anew, given this, taking this into perspective of our Iran policy, but also the importance of embedding it into a new approach to Middle East peace. If anything, this war showed that despite all the normalization, Abraham Accords, the efforts to normalize between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the Palestinian cause is not going away. The Palestinian conflict is not going away. And serious efforts led by the US, it's the indispensable actor on this issue. A serious effort need to be launched for a serious negotiation process going forward, centering the region into that negotiation process. And that's part of the new regional agency that the region is seeking. So the region has to be centered into this new negotiation process, but we can no longer basically say, you normalize Israel and just at the expense of the Palestinians. The Palestinian issue, again, is at the heart of any process, diplomatic effort that's going to go forward between Arab countries and Israel. I'll stop at this point.
Well, thank you, Rhonda, for your brilliant and comprehensive analysis and drawing Iran right into the center of this story. I'm struck by, I'm just looking at Nasrallah's speech, and I thank you, Rhonda, for going over its main points. One of the things he said is, I'm quoting, it's not a question of will we intervene, it's a question of when we will do it. And that is what we've been trying to communicate with our fighters. And so I'm struck, whether that's just sort of bluster in order to keep everyone on guard and pin down the IDF in North Israel, so that there are fewer soldiers available to staff the Gaza operation, or whether that is in fact exactly what Nasrallah intends to do, is to intervene at a later date more than they already have. But what I'm struck by, and I want to turn this, maybe start with Mona, is that the United States and Israel have lost our deterrent edge, and we are now in a reactive phase. It is Iran and the proxies that all of you have reviewed that seem to be setting the agenda and the pace. And it is the United States and Israel that are trying to catch up, restore deterrence, and then look at the day after. And we've seen more statements from the administration of late trying to frame the day after to get around some of the political vulnerabilities that our allies are in right now for the reasons mentioned. So, and this goes back, of course, to Mona's point, which I really like to see some of us elaborate on, is that balance between restoring deterrence may require the use of force. We have the aircraft carrier groups out there, but that's a pretty heavy set of bats to use. How can we restore deterrence without running the risk of escalation? How can we return the initiative into our hands and those of our allies and take it away from Iran and its allies? Mona?
Thanks, David. It's a great question. I actually think it's central to everything we're talking about is this balance between signaling and the need to restore deterrence without spiraling the entire region and, quite frankly, beyond into a conflagration with not just regional but even global implications. And if I could just make a couple points. One is just to underscore, David, to your point, how much the region has evolved while, in a sense, we have been focused, we, the United States, on rising China and, of course, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But meanwhile, we're seeing these non-state actors with pretty significant capabilities that I think need to be, stated outright. The drone capabilities, the ballistic missile, long-range missile capabilities, to include of actors like the Houthis, not to mention the arsenal that Hezbollah has built up in the intervening years since the 2006 war. So there are significant capabilities and significant agency that I think characterizes the region. I think the region is in a new era that is marked by growing agency of all actors, state and non-state alike. So to me, this sort of highlights and heightens exactly the challenge that the United States faces. I don't have the answer to your question, and I think this is, humans are fallible. And I think this is incredibly difficult. What I would say, though, just to sort of kick this discussion off, is, in my view, it's going to have to be a combination of both military measures and enhanced and, frankly, stepped up diplomacy. And that it's going to be the combination of those two things that make a difference. So, yeah, it's important to be, I guess, bringing new assets into the region. The strikes, I think this is the key question, is kinetic action, and to what extent, where, what types of targets make sense versus run the risk again of unintended escalation. But to my mind, if these measures are not paired with diplomacy, that's when I think we run the real risk of unintended escalation that no actors, neither in the region nor the United States, I think, seeks to see. So I think moves like sending Amos Hochstein to Lebanon, having Secretary Blinken for the region, to include Baghdad, to engage with actors that are bridging to our adversaries, in my view, is important, because I think it ideally heads off the potential of miscommunication, miscalculation, and other types of errors. And just to note this, I mean, apparently, if reporting is correct, one of the recent missile strikes on U.S. forces based at the airport in Erbil, in the Kurdish region of Iraq, was hit the barracks, but was unexploded, and therefore there was only one injury. But we are one strike away from a situation in which there may be several U.S. casualties, and where the U.S. will be compelled to respond in a very strong way. And again, I think that's where we're off to the races. So a combination of military deterrence, both some sorts of limited strikes, plus signaling, and most importantly, I think, diplomatic engagement, I hope, can help avert a catastrophic escalation in the region.
Thank you, Mona. I might turn to Ed. Ed, you said a couple things, a lot of things of interest, but two things on this point. One is that the address when dealing with Hezbollah's escalatory potential is not in Beirut, but in Tehran. And building on that, you said that we may need to craft a better Iran strategy than we've had heretofore. Do you want to comment on what we should be doing now to deal with the Iranians that strikes at this problem?
Sure, thank you. So let me just pick up where Mona left off. I think the U.S. has been very clear with Iran that if the proxies escalate beyond a certain point, they're going to be held responsible. So I think the continuation of that understanding has to be driven home with them. Also, Israel, I think, has been counseled not to do anything preemptively. So I think from a diplomatic standpoint, there is action on that front. I think from a military point of view, the United States has to be careful, of course, as Mona said, but the United States has to protect its people and its assets. And in that sense, I think as long as it sticks to that, those goals and objectives, I think they can show Iran that they mean action. They have to strike where we are threatened, the U.S. For instance, if we were to bomb sites in southern Lebanon, that would not be smart. That would not be good. But to bomb sites in Syria and other places where we're threatened, I think is the focus we should have.
Thank you, Ed. So you're advocating a fairly narrowly defined area for kinetic activity combined with, as Mona said, more aggressive diplomacy. Rhonda, what would you recommend American policymakers consider that could actually be effective with Iran? You laid out, I think, quite coherently that Iran's strategy is to, of course, mire all of us in conflict. So the last thing we want to do is enable that strategy, and yet here we are, we're stuck. So, Rhonda. You're on mute.
Okay. I just want to add to Ed that there are credible reports that the Joint Operations Room for the Resistance of Axis, which is coordinating the activities today, have been established in Lebanon, has been established in Lebanon. I'm not calling for strikes on that, but this is where the Joint Operation Room today is. What can the US do? I think what has been done, as both Ed and Mona have said, is what the US can do given present moment, more diplomatic pressure, talking through with interlocutors who have access to and can have, speak with the Iranian. For example, it was noted that Secretary Blinken met with the Iraqi Prime Minister Soudani, who shortly thereafter, in fact, the next day, traveled to Tehran and most probably carried a message to the Iranian officials. And I think kinetic actions, as we have seen, targeting IRGC assets, IRGC bases or IRGC centers in Syria and Iraq, they have had so far limited deterrent effect. Sanctions are in place, and so I don't know what can you do more in that field. And I think I think Arabs today have influence over Iran. I mean, Iran is interested in maintaining this de-escalation process that has been going on for some time with the Arab region. It has interested in having better economic relations and trade with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with Kuwait. It has good relationship with Qatar. And so I think part of our diplomatic activities also have to bring in our partners in the region, the Arab partners, because they have a stake in this, not to expand. And in my opinion, they have more leverage today on Iran than, for example, of course, we do. I mean, we have leverage through sanctions, we have messaging, but they have carrots that they can put on the table, We can put sticks on the table. They have carrots that Iran wants, that the Arab countries, especially GCC countries, can put on the table. And that's where working, when thinking about an Iran strategy, it's not only the P5+1, it's not only the nuclear file. We have to now bring this proxy network as, on an equal, basically plane, on an equal space with the nuclear file. And that's where the Arab countries, especially GCC, can play an important role, given, again, this relationship that has been evolving between them and Iran, and which Iran is interested in maintaining, nurturing, and expanding.
Thank you, Rhonda. In my impression, I left the State Department a few months after the Biden administration came into office, but I definitely had the impression, and I was sent to Lebanon, that the policy at that time was one of trying to disaggregate the issues of the regional challenges that Iran is posing through the proxies and other ways from the Iran file. What I'm hearing from all of you, I guess, is a sense that strategy may or may not have been valid, but certainly now today, it appears that it needs to be changed and a more comprehensive approach needs to be adopted. But we are a Lebanon forum here at Wilson, so maybe I'd like to just dial back a little bit more on Lebanon. Ed mentioned the imperative of trying to get a president elected, which I think everyone agrees with, but hardly at this stage are we likely to see any kind of maneuvering or movement by any of the factions because of the uncertainty in the region and the uncertainty over where the power equation will end up after this conflict. But what should the United States be doing, and building off the point about having a comprehensive strategy that deals with all of the aspects of Iranian power projection? What would we see as an improvement in our approach to Lebanon, or do you regard it as a sideshow and that we should be focused elsewhere? Mona, maybe we could start with you if you'd like, and then I'll turn to Ed and Rhonda.
I don't think Lebanon's a sideshow, but I think we do need to recognize in the moment the limits of our influence in the way I think, David, that you actually very aptly pointed out. I think we ignore Lebanon at our peril. And I do think it's critical that the U.S. remained consistently, I would underscore that word, consistently engaged at a high level on Lebanon. Lebanon is truly a frontline state to this conflict. And again, I think Rhonda has pointed out very well how Hezbollah is seeking to exploit this for its own benefit. And I think, therefore, and here I think Ed pointed this out, and I would underscore, I do think, though there are difficulties in moving toward electing a president, it's more important now than ever that Lebanon address this political vacuum. So that would be the first point. And I think, again, U.S. diplomacy through the Quint, U.S. engagement at a high level and consistently messaging the criticality of Lebanon electing a president, I think is important. At the same time, we can't ignore the extent to which the Lebanese people are suffering, and this unprecedented poverty and food insecurity rates. Again, I think engaging on this creatively, and there are all kinds of creative interventions, quite frankly, that aren't being put in place that can and should be, that seek to address these challenges directly with the Lebanese people as opposed to through a very corrupt government. Those are the kinds of measures, I think, that not only help stabilize Lebanon in the short term, but actually start to signal, frankly, from the U.S. perspective, that we're in this for the long term. And honestly, if we are to shape the trajectory of the region, and I do think it's a battle between two very different visions for the region right now, it's really important for the United States to signal its commitment to the region, and Lebanon is a very important place to do that.
Thank you, Mona. Ed, would you like to comment on this aspect?
Yeah, sure. And I want to just agree with everything Mona said. Let me put it in a few different words. One, we don't have a strategy for Lebanon. We don't have a Middle East regional strategy. So we have to, as Tom Friedman said, you may not care about the Middle East, but it surely cares about you. And we've just got to face the fact that we need a more strategic approach to the region. To make Rhonda's point earlier, how does the Gulf play into this, into an Iran policy? How does it play into Lebanon policy? How does it play into an Israeli policy? We need that, and we've done very well tactically to help Lebanon with projects. Our ambassador's done a great job in terms of bringing programs and policies to bear on the people and tactically offer programs that help the Lebanese armed forces and other programs. But what is it that we're trying to get done there? And is Lebanon just a sideshow for an Iran policy or an Israeli policy? So we need to really think through that. And one other point, public diplomacy has to be part of our diplomacy. We can go a lot further if the administration is being pushed by the American public to do the right thing, and the president is understanding of that public diplomacy effort in the United States and also in the region. We need to really message better what we're trying to do in order to improve, I think, our image and what our goals are. It's very hard to know what our goals are today.
That's a good point. So I'll turn to Randa. I'm on the question of U.S. policy toward Lebanon, and I just want to throw out one comment, one observation. And I've been involved in Lebanon going back to the late 80s, when Hezbollah was a dangerous but terrorist organization, but not really a political player, to where we are today, where Nasrallah is purporting anyway to speak for all Lebanese people and making life and death decisions, even though no one's elected him or even appointed him to a constitutional office. And I'm not blaming U.S. policy for that, but maybe the oscillations in our level of attention to Lebanon was a factor that enabled Hezbollah to expand the way it has. Randa, would you like to comment on that or anything else? You're muted still.
I keep forgetting this to unmute myself. Look, after all, I'm not going to blame what happened blame all problems of Lebanon to what happens in 1983 after the exit of the US from Lebanon and basically the handing over the file to Syria and indirectly through that to Iran. And we ended up with, Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is what it is today. I think, look, as long as that political space that is Lebanon is not contested on a continual basis by the United States, these other actors, primarily now Iran, is going to be gaining more of a foothold. I don't think, it used to be contested primarily by Saudi Arabia, and that was some kind of balancing against Iranian presence. I think it's very clear that the Saudis are no longer interested in Lebanon. They are part of the quintet. They have contributed some money to this humanitarian channel that they have established with the French, which was pittance, to be very honest. But there's no interest there. The days of the late King Abdullah, where Lebanon was very much a personal, it was a personal significance to the king himself, are gone, and they are gone for good. The Gulf now looks at their engagement, Gulf countries in the region, through very much hardcore business, economic, transactional approach. And so so we can argue the importance of having the Saudis and having, the rest of the Arabs in the quintet, but it's a clear, I don't see those days where that space can be contested by the Arabs versus Iran is going to come back. And so the question falls on us, falls on the US, because without contestation of that political space, without contestation for the hearts and minds of Lebanese, Hezbollah, players like Hezbollah, Iran are going to gain more and more of a foothold. And the question is, I don't know, do we want them to do that? It's very clear that the Arab Gulf countries, primarily Saudi Arabia, has decided it's a loss for us. You know, they want to get Lebanon, fine. It's a failed country, fine, they can get it. But the question is for us, you know, for the United States. This is a question we need to address. Are we okay? Is it in our national interest? Is it in our strategic interest in the region, but also, you know, at large, to have basically Hezbollah and Iran be the decision maker in Lebanon? And that's where we are heading. I mean, it's already there, but there is still, in my opinion, space for contestation of that role. But I think after what happens in Gaza, and depending on what happens in Gaza, I think that space might be, you know, closed pretty quickly.
Thank you, Rhonda. I agree, and certainly has been the case for a while that the Saudis basically want to wash their hands of Lebanon. But I think we were also hearing from everyone on the panel the importance that we have for the United States to have a comprehensive strategy that looks at the entire region as one theater and has approaches that deal with all the ways that Iran is challenging us in both positive and negative ways in terms of U.S. policy. And I would hope that our allies also, like Saudi Arabia, see it the same way. I mean, after all, it was Hamas that seems to have scuttled, for the time being anyway, or postponed the emerging deal between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel that had, at least on the table, important components of security guarantees for the Saudis. Which brings me to the audience, and we have a question from William, a student, on just this very issue. What can the United States do to involve Saudi Arabia in more in deterrence and de-escalation? So I take the question to be not just in Lebanon, but also regionally. Ed, maybe we could start with you.
Well, two things. Just to make Mona's earlier point about Lebanon, it's so important that the Quint now lead. The time is really important for these countries to come together. The United States needs to push and pull them, and then they need to get Qatar and Saudi on the same page and into the country to help bring about some consensus on a presidential candidate. Saudi is key to that because Qatar won't move without Saudi's agreement. So the five of them are going to have to be in total agreement. That's one important reason why Saudi is important. The second thing is, I think the most important country to Israel the day after is Saudi in so many ways. They have an interest to move towards normalization. The United States working with Saudi, Qatar, UAE, Egypt, and a few other countries, I think can craft the right kind of approach that entices Israel to move in the right direction. So I think those are two areas where Saudi could be helpful.
Thank you, Ed. Which leads me to another, Rhonda, you have your finger up, and then we'll take another question from the audience.
I just want to say, just second what Ed has said. I think despite the fact that Saudi Arabia is really not interested in investing more of its political capital in the country, but at the same time, for example, I totally agree with Ed. It has actively prevented Qatar from moving forward on the issue of presidential elections, especially because, you know, it has to be done through in working with Tehran. And I think Saudi has really put a firm red line on Qatar in terms of engaging with Tehran on the Lebanon file. And so that's where I think the block is today.
Very helpful. So building on all this, Ambassador David Mack, former Ambassador David Mack is listening to us, and he asked, is it really possible to resolve the Hamas-Israel war without a resumed peace process that establishes a Palestinian state? I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to tackle that one. I don't see a lot of volunteers, but the question's been asked. So maybe Ed, we'll start with you.
No, I don't see that there can be resolution to this, nor is it in America's interest not to put front and center now the eventual resolution for a peace process. And like I said before, every time they talk publicly about that war, they should also mention self-determination for a Palestinian state. But it will take a group of countries coming together. And a day of reckoning is coming. Will the Bibi Netanyahu government be amenable to constructive conversations on a peace process? And you talk about a balancing act. At what point does the United States have to stand up to Bibi and perhaps face disagreement? So those are going to be really tough questions politically and from a messaging point of view.
Can I say something here, Dave?
Please, Rhonda, yeah.
I think the problem is going to be forward, and that's a big roadblock, is going to be the Palestinian leadership and the Israeli leadership, I think, to move forward. I think building on what Ed said, the Netanyahu government, I mean, Netanyahu himself has been, he made his political career pivot around opposition and prevention of the two-state solution. So any talk about two-state solution, as long as he's in government, and especially with his, red extremist right-wing allies, I don't think it's going to go forward. So, but it's up to the Israelis, and hopefully nudged a little bit by the Americans, to make that decision after the war, or, But also, I think we have a PA that has been weak, that has rife with corruption. After all, Hamas won election in 2007 in Gaza, partly people opposing, the PA. This was an opposition vote against the PA at the time and its corruption. And the PA has not improved its patterns since then, its infrastructure. I mean, they haven't held elections now for a long time in the West Bank. And so I think work has to be done at both levels, on the Palestinian level, in terms of strengthening new voices inside the PA that are seen credible by the Palestinians, but also inside Israel in terms of changes in the Israeli cabinet.
Well, thank you, Rhonda. I see that Congressman Issa may have joined us. Are you online?
I am.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I know it's a busy time in Congress, but we're so very honored to have you, sir. And we've had a good, robust discussion of Iran and Hezbollah, rounding around now to the Palestinian cause. But we'd love to hear from you, sir. So I'll turn the mic to you.
Well, thank you. And I guess the most important thing to look at is the current escalation, unintended, but certainly happening, with Iran having the Houthis shoot down one of our Predator drones, and our response of attacking depots in Syria. I can't think of a more classic expansion where we don't just have the Hezbollah element, we now have depots in Syria that likely bring us into 4 countries, maybe 5 countries, and direct involvement. And so, the concern that I have is that we have no clear path to de-escalate this, except to, quite frankly, to change our relationship with Iran in a way that changes their calculus. And I don't see that happening in the short run. So that, to me, unfortunately, that means a lot of suffering for the Palestinian people. And instead of a 31-day war like we had in 2006, this could go on perhaps as long as the Saudis and the Yemeni conflict has gone on. So that's my concern, is that right now, I think just in the last 48 hours, we've seen a confirmation of an escalation that has been going on in the background, but the response by the U.S. pretty much makes it clear that they can no longer tolerate the sort of attacks on our troops. Other than that, obviously there's a challenge here in Congress that there is funding for Israel, but there really isn't a consensus on what role the U.S. and I think, Ambassador, you'd be the first to say, we must be a factor in de-escalating this. And right now, I don't know that we've we've got a concrete plan, or at least Congress hasn't been made aware of one. Other than that, I do think that the other question, and it's a question that I was in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain when this broke out, can we find a way to not roll back or even roll forward the continued involvement of Saudi Arabia and others in what was to be a pathway toward not just Israel, but the Palestinians having a clear guidance. That is my biggest concern, is this war will end, but where will we be in the sense of the Arab world and Israel coming to some sort of an agreement on something that will help the Palestinians have a pathway that they don't currently have and they're not heading toward. So that's a lot of double talk, but it's 24 years of this, and you even longer. You look and say, I thought Sharon had it tough 17 years ago, but this is a much tougher time.
It certainly is tough times, Congressman. I before you joined us, I think that it'd be fair for me to summarize that the group of panelists believe that one of the tasks ahead of us now is to understand that we need a comprehensive approach to Iran, that we need to understand that this is a single theater. Iran's behavior on the nuclear file can't be disaggregated from its behavior with the proxies. And I'm wondering if, and I take your point that in the short run, it's going to be difficult to launch a new policy, but we have to be laying the groundwork for it. And I wondered if you'd like to elaborate on that. Because the other thing is, for a consistent, comprehensive strategy to work, it needs to have sufficient political support across the aisle so that it is something that it persists over time, not just for one administration or the other.
Well, you couldn't be more accurate, and that was why I was pointing out the escalation and then balancing it with the trip that Senator Ernst and I had taken on. As we look at how do we get comprehensive, comprehensive is making Iran the South Africa of our generation. Obviously South Africa wasn't trying to be a nuclear power and expand, but they found themselves isolated at the UN. They found themselves isolated from almost all their trading partners, and eventually it led to a change in the government's, the government itself. Iran has never faced that. Currently, they have very cordial relations with and self-serving with both Russia and China, and it seems to be enough for them. In addition to the axis of those that they fund, including their relationship with Iraq, which is tenuous, Syria, which is self-serving, etc. So, can we change the dynamic? I think we can, because if we look for a moment at the Gulf states, if ultimately we form a U.S. / the rest of the world other than the ones I named, what happens is those countries, including China's calculus changes. They want to have good relations with Iran, but they really don't want Iran as a member of the nuclear club. They just simply don't look at it as their problem. They want the oil from Iran, but if it begins to affect their relations for gas and oil with other Arab states, then Iran is not a single source that China can count on. And that becomes one of the questions is, are we willing to have an Iran policy that says to China, if you want to backdoor Iran's oil, then we and our allies are going to be less interested in accommodating what is actually the majority of your petroleum needs. So those kind of policies, as you say, are going to take time. I think the engagement with those partners who share, when I'm with the Crown Prince, with MBS, for example, in Saudi Arabia, and he sounds like Bibi Netanyahu when he's talking about Iran, it's not because they went to the same high school. It's because they view the threat and the need to contain that threat and roll it back as soon as possible. And this, by the way, from a ruler who recently came to a détente, if you will, with Iran, because he felt that he had to. So, you know, one of the calculus that the U.S. has to have is, can we be such a good ally? Sorry about that. That we can be such a good ally that that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, particularly, don't feel that they have to be quite as kind to Iran. But look, it's a huge change. It has to be almost a Reagan-esque change, where you look and say, no, we're not just putting our warships to have a show of force. Any misbehavior will be met with immediate action, and the commanders have the authority on the ships. That's not the case right now. I think, lastly, this administration inherited an obligation from the Obama administration to have a nuclear policy that's completely disconnected from the expansion of terrorism and the attempt to build, for better or worse, a Shia sort of an axis. I think that's where you alluded to. This administration has to say they have to be coupled. We can no longer decouple it. Nuclear makes you immune from the things that would stop you from funding terrorism. But wait a second. Then the goal was to have them stop funding terrorism. If they weren't funding terrorism, would we actually be as concerned about their nuclear ambitions? And I think the answer would be no. We have to look and say it's your behavior that you've been doing since 1979 that has to change. And oh, by the way, we would be much more supportive of peaceful nuclear and much more trusting if we didn't see your ulterior motives. So I don't expect this administration to change quickly, but I do believe that current events, including the Houthis literally attacking U.S. assets on Iran's behalf, should give a pause for thought on whether or not the negotiations with Iran should take an expansive turn. And, I think you mentioned Congress has to be united. Bob Menendez over in the Senate and Greg Meeks and Darrell Issa and a host of us are not normally allies, but the level of willingness to work together by everyone except a few who essentially want no foreign policy is pretty strong right now. How much we're willing to put into money and so on, that's always a different aspect. But the ability to have foreign affairs be very united on this, even to push back on the administration's policy by some of my Democrats, I think it's there. One of the challenges is Republicans have to be more supportive of Democrats as they do the hard work, because it's harder to take on a president of your own party and tell them that they have to do more. And so that's one of the things I think that those of us who are senior members have to be aware of, is we're asking the other party to do things that are hard. So we have to be supportive overtly and be honest behind the scenes. And I think we're doing some of it. I'd like to do more of it.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear, Congressman, so thank you for that. And I want to ask you a question I asked the group earlier, which was specifically about American policy toward Lebanon. If we're talking about a comprehensive approach that deals with all aspects of Iranian behavior in the region, obviously Lebanon is an aspect of that. We heard Nasrallah's speech Friday, which was just a reminder that because of his weapons and Iranian support, he can ignore all the other Lebanese actors and pretend that he speaks for Lebanese when, of course, he doesn't. What would you advise us and U.S. policymakers, more importantly, on Lebanon?
Well, this has been kind of a changing approach of mine. A couple of years ago, or a year ago, November, I had a kind of a knockdown drag out with Speaker Berry in his office, and he ended the meeting waving the Constitution and threw us out rather abruptly. He didn't call it throwing out. He just said the meeting was over, because essentially we've reached a point, I think, for most Americans, including Lebanese Americans and other supporters, that the status quo isn't acceptable. Since the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, none of the leaders, none of the parliamentary leaders, and none of the prime ministers has been willing, including Saad Hariri, I'll say, has been willing to have the kind of courage to say, we have to bring back a Lebanon that has no militias. We have to bring back a Lebanon that cares about Lebanon and not about its foreign neighbors. That has really disappeared. And as a result, saying, well, we're stabilizing Lebanon and we're helping, I think tough love is now in the future. And tough love does mean that there have to be greater sanctions. Those sanctions have to include current leaders in Lebanon whose behavior is clearly, even if they're not, quote, Hezbollah, in support of that agenda, or at least in hiding. And of course, when it comes to public corruption, it's an easy tool for us to go after, because one thing in Lebanon is that corruption has become so widespread that it's not hard to find anywhere. That's not popular in Lebanon, but I do think it's an American policy change. It does mean that, I hate to say it, is that we who have supported Lebanon for a long time perhaps made one mistake, which was we empowered the status quo in a way in which Hezbollah was allowed to have their cake and eat it too. And that's going to have to change. That does mean that at some point, U.S. involvement is going to be less friendly, less supportive, less, we'll give your military the assistance and because we have ISIS, but we understand that it'll never take on Hezbollah, even as weapons come in out of Syria, or weapons production materials come from Syria and flow through to the south openly in front of people of all branches of government. That's going to have to change. I'm not sure that we're positioned for it, but I will say, with the evacuation of many of the assets of the embassy, I'm going to encourage that we not go back to business as usual. We not go back to trying to fully staff the embassy until we, in fact, decide how policy is going to be implemented. And it may be that a less friendly situation, including visas and all the other things that we have grown used to with Lebanon, may have to change. The last thing is, look, we've supported elections in Lebanon for a long time. Elections don't matter as long as one element, Hezbollah, is armed, because the last election, in theory, would have led to a different speaker. It would have led to a different government. It hasn't happened. And we're certainly no closer to having a president willing to stand up for a single Lebanon. So this is just one Lebanese American talking, but I have talked to my colleagues in the Lebanese Friendship Caucus, and they're all, including Darren LaHood and others, we're all of like mind that some form of tough love has to be supported with this administration. And when I say tough, I mean a lot tougher. And lastly, look, we've always said the Lebanese civil war, and we talk about it in the past tense. I, for one, no longer want to talk about it in the past tense. The civil war never ended as long as one militia remained armed. The civil war is there. It's Hezbollah intimidating all the other portions who thought they could go on with life, who could make an agreement not to fight. That agreement does not include, unfortunately, Hezbollah. So my view is we have to treat it like a country that's in civil war, and that one element is willing to attack Israel, and that element has to be viewed as more of an enemy than we've been willing to do. I'm not sure what that turns out to in policy, but what I will say is this administration is heading toward being willing to have attacks like the one yesterday that actually hit Syria. During the Bush administration, it was sort of a bright line. We never would fire on areas in Syria, and neither would Israel. I think lifting that is productive, that if there's a depot just over the border and you hit it, you're hitting the right place. And I say that because in 2006, I watched Israel hit civilian targets throughout the country and decimate people who just wanted to be out of the fighting. And I think the targeting of legitimate military targets wherever they are is going to be part of this administration's policy, and it's certainly part of Congress's movement toward asking them to do that.
Thank you very much, Congressman. We're about to run out of time. So I want to thank you, sir, for joining us. And I want to thank our other three panelists for the really incredible depth and breadth of their analysis that they shared with all of us. And I guess I get the last word. So it's agreement, Congressman, that if we do more of the same in terms of policy, we'll get more of the same in terms of results. So it is time to reevaluate. Thank you all.